What happens when an empire rises in the shadow of another but refuses to remain there? Beneath the golden sands of Nubia lies a kingdom older than memory and stronger than most ever realized. A civilization that built pyramids sharper than Giza, ruled Egypt as pharaohs, forged iron while others shaped bronze, and wrote a language we still cannot read. The Kingdom of Kush defied borders, expectations, and time itself, and yet many have never heard its name. Who were the Black Pharaohs who crossed the Nile and wore the double crown of Egypt? How did the city of Meroë become a center of iron production, trade, and ritual in the heart of Africa? What secrets sleep beneath the dunes, written in symbols no one alive fully understands? From the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal to the forgotten frescoes of Christian Nubia, from temples that whisper forgotten prayers to tombs that still wait unopened, this is the journey into one of history's most misunderstood empires. This is not just archaeology, it is rediscovery. This is not just history, it is legacy. Step into the silence, walk the path carved by kings and queens. Listen closely, because the past is not gone, it is waiting, and the Kingdom of Kush is ready to speak. The air was thick with silence when I arrived at the first cataract of the Nile. Not the silence of stillness, but the kind that hums, alive, as if the stones themselves were remembering. Here, where the river raged and narrowed, the land changed. Egypt ended, and something older, wilder began. This is where the Kingdom of Kush would stir into being, not with armies or monuments, but with roots deep and ancient. The region we call Nubia today once stood as the threshold between Africa's heart and the Mediterranean's gaze. The Nile here does not meander. It surges. It breaks against rock and rolls through narrow passages carved over endless millennia. Life clung to its banks, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. In this land of extremes, people learned not just to endure, but to shape the world around them. Long before the name Kush was spoken in the courts of pharaohs, there were communities building their lives in this river valley. They farmed along its fertile floodplains. They hunted in the savannah. They shaped pottery and worked stone with methods we still puzzle over. Some of the earliest signs of settlement date back over 7,000 years, and even in those earliest layers of time, something distinct begins to emerge. A culture both connected and independent, a people who were watching the same stars but drawing different conclusions. Standing in the low dunes south of Aswan, I found shards of pottery still embedded in the earth. Some bore patterns never seen in Egyptian wares. Others hinted at distant trade. Lapis from the east, obsidian from the south, ivory, incense, and gold. These were not isolated tribes. They were nodes in a growing web, and that web would one day call itself a kingdom. But power in this region never rose from monuments first. It came from control of the river, of trade, of sacred knowledge. To understand the birth of the Nile Kingdom is to understand how people turned geography into destiny. The Nile's cataracts, while dangerous, served as both gate and guardian. The people who lived among them learned to read the river, to control its crossings, to tax what passed through. They did not merely survive here, they thrived by understanding what others feared. I spent an afternoon tracing the stone alignments near the oldest known settlements. From above, they do not seem like much, just rocks in the dust. But when the light bends low at sunset, they catch fire with shadow. And in those shadows, alignments appear: north, east, solstice, equinox. These people were astronomers, perhaps priests, They were not waiting to be discovered by Egypt. They were building something entirely their own. By the 3rd millennium, by the Common Era, the identity of this region was solidifying. The Egyptians would later call it Ta Seti, the land of the bow, but to its people it was simply home, a place of hunters and smiths, of cattle herders and river folk, a culture that carved its story into rocks and mines long before the world began to listen. As I pressed my hand into the warm earth, I imagined what it must have felt like to be here then, to stand at the edge of the known world, to feel the pull of the river and the weight of the sun, to watch your children grow beside crocodile-filled waters and still believe in something greater. The Kingdom of Kush did not begin with kings. It began with the river, and with the quiet decision of a people to stay and make the land remember their names. This was not the echo of Egypt, it was the murmur before the song, the first breath of a kingdom that would one day challenge empires. The sun was still climbing when I first saw it, a ridge of earth and stone rising from the plains, crowned by weathered ruins that once formed a city. Kerma, the heart of a civilization that bloomed long before the pyramids of Kush, long before Egypt's shadow stretched this far south. I walked among fragments of mud brick, polished floors turned to dust, and strange circular chambers whose purpose still stirs debate. This place whispered of order, ambition, and age-old sovereignty. Kerma was no frontier outpost. It was a capital, a seat of power that ruled for centuries over Lower Nubia. Archaeologists call it the Kerma culture, and their findings speak of refinement and resilience. This city rose as early as 2,500 years before the Common Era, perhaps even earlier. At its height, it flourished in parallel with Egypt's Middle Kingdom, not beneath it. As I moved through the remains of what once was the Great Western Dafufa, I ran my hand across its baked bricks. The structure stands out even now, a solid, towering mass nearly 20 meters high, believed to have served religious or ceremonial purposes. Its walls absorbed centuries of heat. They hold the memory of rituals lost to time. The very architecture is foreign to the Egyptian eye. It is Nubian, purely so, and it tells us something essential. These were not imitators. The people of Kerma did not merely survive the desert. They shaped it. They built irrigation systems to harness the Nile's seasonal floods. They cultivated sorghum and barley. They raised cattle prized above all other possessions. Wealth flowed into the city in the form of gold, ivory, ebony, and incense. Trade routes ran south into Inner Africa and north into Egypt. Kerma sat at the crossroads of civilizations and held its ground. I stood at the edge of the royal cemetery, where hundreds of burial mounds ripple across the earth like waves. Some stretch nearly 90 meters in diameter. These are not casual graves. These are monuments to the dead. Inside them, archaeologists have found the remains of attendants, horses, fine ceramics, and goods from far-off lands. The burials speak of a ruling class that held real authority, perhaps even divinity. And yet, it was not just the scale of Kerma that left its mark on me. It was the artistry. Pottery from Kerma is among the finest ever produced in ancient Africa. Burnished black on top, deep red below, often flawlessly symmetrical. I held a fragment once, still cool from the night, and imagined the hand that shaped it, the eye that judged its curve. These were not primitive villagers. These were craftsmen, engineers, thinkers, citizens of a kingdom that knew its worth. The relationship between Kerma and Egypt was never simple. Sometimes there was trade, sometimes conflict. There were periods of alliance, followed by war. The Egyptians referred to Kerma's rulers as chiefs of the vile Kush, a phrase that reveals as much about fear as it does contempt. Kerma grew strong enough to challenge Pharaonic Egypt, its armies advancing north during times of Egyptian weakness. They were not merely reacting to history, they were writing their own. But all cities change. In time, Kerma would face the expanding power of Egypt's new kingdom. Its walls would be breached, its temples desecrated, its people drawn into the orbit of a foreign empire. Yet the spirit of Kerma did not vanish. It receded into the hills, into bloodlines, into stories whispered beside firelight. And from that ember, a new power would one day rise. As the wind moved across the plain and tugged at my coat, I stood silent among the ruins. I felt the presence of a city that had once claimed this river, not as subject, but as sovereign. Kerma was more than a city. It was the first great heartbeat of Kush, and its echoes still moved beneath the sand. The river was quiet that morning, too quiet. As I drifted south along the Nile, the air felt heavy, like breath held too long. This was the land where Egypt's reach once gripped tight, where temples were renamed, gods recarved, and Nubian soil soaked in foreign command. Yet even beneath that shadow, the roots of Kush endured, hidden in valleys, carried in blood, waiting for their moment to rise again. After the fall of Kerma, Egypt pushed deep into Nubia. It was during the New Kingdom, around the 15th century before the Common Era, that Egyptian pharaohs claimed dominion as far south as the Fourth Cataract. They established forts and temples, carved their names into rocks that were not theirs, and brought with them the cults of Amun, Ra, and Osiris. In their wake came priests, governors, tax collectors. For nearly 500 years, Nubia was an occupied land. I stood among the columns of an abandoned temple at Soleb. Egyptian hieroglyphs still cling to the stone, bleached by centuries of light. The depictions are clear: pharaohs making offerings, foreign lands kneeling in submission. Yet something about the scenes felt strained, performative, a mask of control worn too tightly. The occupation was thorough, yes, but it was never complete. In the hills, away from the Nile's gleaming temples, the Kushite identity endured. Families kept their customs. Songs survived in hidden tongues. Cattle were still buried with care. Some Nubians even rose within the Egyptian administration, learning the language of power from within. But they never forgot who they were. They watched. They waited. And slowly, as Egypt weakened, a new rhythm began to pulse beneath the surface. By the 11th century before the Common Era, Egypt itself was splintering. The great pharaohs had faded. Civil war loomed in the north. Priests in Thebes began to rule like kings. And in the south, far from the gaze of a faltering empire, a spark began to glow again in Nubia. A city called Napata, a sacred mountain, a people remembering their strength. The resurgence did not come in fanfare, it came in lineage, in temples rebuilt, in the silent coronation of local rulers who now called themselves kings. These were not rebels, they were heirs. Heirs to Kerma, to Kush, to a legacy the Egyptians had tried to overwrite. And from this emboldened lineage, a name would emerge that would change history: Alara. Little is known of King Alara's life. No grand tale tells his tale. But every record that follows names him as the beginning, the founder of the 25th dynasty of Egypt, the father of a Kushite revival that would not merely resist Egypt, but rule it. Alara's children and grandchildren would cross the river, then the deserts, then the very halls of Thebes and Memphis. They would sit on pharaonic thrones. They would write their names in Egyptian script, yes, but they would speak in a voice shaped by Kush. As I sat beneath the shade of an acacia tree overlooking the Nile, I imagined what it must have felt like to witness that moment. A people rising from occupation, not with bitterness, but with purpose. The Kushites had absorbed centuries of pressure and turned it into strength. From the ruins of subjugation, they forged an identity both ancient and new. They did not burn the temples, they reclaimed them. This was no rebellion, it was resurrection. A phoenix rising in silence, shaped in Egypt's shadow, but born of older fires. The Kingdom of Kush would rise again, not as a subject of empire, but as empire itself. The sun was still low when I first glimpsed it, Jebel Barkal rising like a sentinel above the desert plain. A mountain not tall, yet somehow immense, its summit crowned with strange shapes that from a distance resemble a rearing cobra, sacred and silent. The locals say the gods sleep there, and once, long ago, so did kings. This was Napata, the spiritual heart of Kush, a city shaped not just by stone and water, but by myth and memory. As I approached the base of the mountain, the wind carried fine grains of sand that whispered against my coat. Before me stood the crumbled remains of temples, columns half buried, lintels collapsed, their hieroglyphs fading but still legible in the morning light. These stones belonged to the Temple of Amun, built in the Egyptian style, yes, but with a spirit deeply Nubian. This was no colonial outpost. This was the soul of a nation. Napata emerged as the capital of Kush sometime after the Egyptian withdrawal from Nubia, around the 11th century BC 1740. In the vacuum of foreign power, something indigenous grew, centered here, at the foot of a mountain believed to be the earthly home of the god Amun. The choice was not arbitrary, it was sacred. The mountain's form itself, resembling the uraeus, the cobra symbol of divine authority, was seen as a sign. Here, kings were not merely rulers, they were chosen. I stepped into what remains of the processional way, the ancient path along which priests and kings would move during rituals. The scent of sun-warmed stone filled the air. In its prime, this place would have echoed with drums, chants, and the heavy scent of incense. Statues of Amun once stood tall here, eyes inlaid with gold leaf, staring out across the valley. But more than that, Napata was where legitimacy was born. To rule Kush, to even dream of ruling Egypt, a king had to be crowned here. The rulers of the Kushite Renaissance, beginning with Alara and continuing with his descendants, built and expanded Napata. They brought Egyptian priests, scribes, and artisans to shape their temples, but always with a distinctly Nubian touch. The art shifted, the language blurred. Pharaohs from the south began to write in hieroglyphs, but the faces they carved were their own, broad, proud, unmistakably Kushite. Napata was not just a city of ceremony. It was a crucible of identity. Here, tradition fused with ambition. The kings of Napata saw themselves as restorers of divine order, not usurpers. When they marched north to take Egypt, they did so not as conquerors, but as chosen stewards. From the quiet sanctuaries of this sacred mountain, they claimed the mantle of the two lands. One cannot stand in Napata and not feel the weight of presence. The silence here is not empty, it is listening. Every ruined wall, every fallen statue bears the mark of ritual. This was a city that breathed belief. Even in its decline, even when the capital would later shift to Meroë, Napata retained its spiritual gravity. Kings continued to be buried here, near Jebel Barkal, for generations. In life they ruled from elsewhere, but in death they returned home. As the sun climbed higher and the shadows drew back into the stone, I lingered a moment longer beneath the cliffs. I pressed my palm against the warm rock, as others once had, priests, travelers, monarchs. I felt not just history, but continuity. Napata was more than a capital. It was a vow, a place where power bowed to faith, and where a mountain became a throne. The stone of Karnak still remembers. It holds the footsteps of kings, the scent of old incense, the chill of pre-dawn rituals. I stood beneath its columns, tall as giants, and imagined the moment it happened. When a new power crossed the Nile, not from the north, but from the south. Not with foreign banners, but with ancient purpose. The Black Pharaohs had arrived, and for a fleeting moment the world turned southward. They came from Kush, from Napata's sacred silence and Jebel Barkal's shadow. Their lineage traced through generations of kings who remembered when their lands were ruled by Egypt and when they were not. Now the tables had turned, divided by weak rulers and religious strife. The north groaned under chaos, the south stirred with clarity, and from that clarity came a king named Piye. Piye, son of Alara's line, did not begin as a conqueror. He began as a priest king, crowned in Napata, devoted to Amen. But when the northern rulers of Egypt descended into petty wars, Piye saw not opportunity but obligation. He believed in Ma'at, the divine order of the world, and he believed Egypt had lost it, so he moved, with reverence, with command, with army and prayer alike. I traced his story through temple inscriptions, carved with precision into sandstone walls. Piye did not raise cities, he offered them grace. He sent messages to the wavering lords of Egypt. He gave them a chance to submit not to his sword, but to the order he claimed to restore. Some resisted, others bowed, and when he took Memphis, he did not destroy it, he purified it, bathed himself in its sacred lake, made offerings to its gods, then returned to Napata, leaving Egypt in the hands of those who accepted his rule. It was not ego that defined Piye, it was faith. He saw his kingship as divine mission, and from this mission a dynasty was born, the 25th dynasty of Egypt, a line of Kushite rulers who would wear the double crown, who would sit upon the throne of Horus, who would revive the glories of old Egypt while never forgetting who they were. Shabaka came next, Piye's brother or son. He consolidated what Piye had begun, moving the royal court to Memphis, yet continuing to honor Napata. Under his rule, architecture flourished. Temples were restored, laws codified. In one remarkable act, Shabaka ordered a decaying philosophical text to be copied onto stone. The result is known today as the Shabaka stone. Then came Taharka, a name carved into the bones of history. Warrior, builder, visionary. During his reign, Egypt reached its greatest territorial extent in centuries. He built at Karnak, at Tanis, at Kawa. His image survives in granite and gold. Yet even as he stood strong, new threats loomed from the east. The Assyrians, a rising empire with ambitions of its own. I saw echoes of those conflicts etched in battle reliefs and broken statuary. Taharka fought hard, so did his successor Tantamani, but the tides were turning. Eventually, the Assyrians sacked Thebes. Egypt fractured again, and the Kushite pharaohs, their mission fulfilled or defeated depending on one's view, withdrew back to Napata. But they did not vanish. They returned not as exiles, but as kings. Their pyramids still stand in the Nubian sands, narrower, steeper than those of Giza, but just as proud. The Black Pharaohs had ruled Egypt with discipline, with vision, and with a memory older than the Nile's own course. As the light shifted through the ruins, I felt it again, that sensation of presence, of lives once lived with conviction. The Black Pharaohs did not rewrite Egypt. They reminded it who it was, and in doing so, they carved Kush into the very marrow of pharaonic legacy, not as outsiders, as inheritors. The wind carried a hush as I stepped into the necropolis of El Karu. Before me, stone pyramids rose from the earth, not grand and sprawling like those of Giza, but steep, sharp, and close to the sky. Each stood like a finger pointing heavenward. These were not the monuments of imitation, they were declarations, symbols of a kingdom that knew power was not just exercised, it was carved, brick by brick, into memory. Here, in the dry silence of Nubia, the Kushite kings shaped their own vision of eternity. The pyramids at El Karu and later at Nuri and Meroë did not merely echo Egypt, they reimagined it. Smaller in scale but rich in meaning, they stood as gateways between worlds. Death was not an end here, it was a transformation, and architecture was the language of that passage. I walked the base of Taharka's pyramid at Nuri. Time had worn its surface, but the geometry remained intact, precise, imposing. Inside, a sloping tunnel led downward into the earth. The walls were carved with spells, prayers, images of gods whose names echoed between Egypt and Kush, Amun, Osiris, Isis, but alongside them, local deities whispered back, lion-headed protectors, ancestral spirits. The blend was seamless. It told of a culture that did not erase what it borrowed. The temples followed the same thread. In Napata and Meroë, at Kawa and Soleb, I found ruins that once radiated divine presence. These were not merely places of worship, they were blueprints of the universe. Their axes aligned with stars, their chambers mirrored creation myths. The Temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal, in particular, struck me. Built against the mountain believed to be the home of the god himself, it felt less like construction and more like revelation. In the cool shadow of its crumbling walls, I ran my hand along faded reliefs, scenes of kings making offerings, receiving crowns, standing beside gods with eyes that still glinted in the morning light. The detail was exquisite, the stories layered, and always, the king stood at the center, not as a man above men, but as a bridge between earth and the divine. Architecture, here, was not just for the living, it was built for the eternal. The placement of a column, the curve of a doorway, the height of a pylon, each carried intention. Each reflected a worldview where harmony meant survival. These temples were not designed to dominate the landscape. They were meant to become part of it. And they endure. Even broken, they speak. The pyramids at Meroë, scattered across the sands like forgotten teeth, still pierce the skyline. Some were looted, others weathered, but many remain. Inside, the burial chambers preserve delicate paintings, queens with elaborate jewelry, kings seated beneath stars, scenes of judgment and ascension. The colors fade, but the messages persist. Life is brief. What struck me most, though, was how consistent the vision remained across centuries. From the earliest tombs of Kerma to the final pyramid at Meroë, the architecture of Kush reveals a civilization with a coherent voice. It believed in power, yes, but power anchored in the sacred, in the cyclical, in the unseen forces that shape empires and individuals alike. As the sun dipped low behind the ridge and long shadows crossed the sand, I stood among the stones and felt their gravity. The Kushites did not build for spectacle. They built to endure. Every wall, every chapel, every sacred enclosure was a statement. We were here, we understood, and we shaped the world in stone to prove it. The ground beneath my boots crunched with dark, brittle flakes. Not rock, not ash, but slag. The remains of ancient furnaces. I was standing on the outskirts of Meroë, a city once veiled in smoke and flame. Here, in the heart of Nubia's savanna, the Kingdom of Kush forged more than power. It forged metal, and in doing so, it crafted its legacy not only in stone, but in steel. Meroë did not rise suddenly. It grew gradually as Napata waned and the kingdom's center shifted southward. The reasons were many: climate, pressure from invaders, trade routes evolving with time. But in Meroë, Kush found something vital: iron. A source of wealth and strength buried beneath the hills and plains. Where earlier kings built temples, these rulers built furnaces. The air once rang with the rhythm of hammers, the glow of fire-shaped tools, weapons, and the bones of empire. I wandered through the industrial quarters where hundreds of furnaces once stood. Their low mounds and circular bases remain like ancient fingerprints. The slag heaps stretch for miles, darkening the sand. This was not a small operation. It was massive, organized, intentional. Meroë was a powerhouse of iron production, likely the largest in Africa for centuries. And yet, for all its importance, this chapter of Kushite history is only now being understood. Iron changed everything. It gave Kush an edge, literally and politically. Tools improved agriculture, weapons improved defense. And with these advantages, Meroë could control trade routes that cut across the eastern desert, through the Red Sea, and down into the heart of Africa. Gold, ivory, ebony, frankincense, all flowed through Meroë's gates. The city became a node, a nexus, where goods, cultures, and ideas collided. I met local historians who described Meroë not just as an industrial center, but as a cosmopolitan one. Its streets were wide, its markets vibrant, its artisans skilled in pottery, jewelry, textiles. Evidence of Indian spices and Chinese silk suggest a network that reached farther than most imagined. And unlike the arid grandeur of Egyptian cities, Meroë thrived among trees and rivers. The land here was different, lush in places, more forgiving. The iron industry was not merely about technology. It was also deeply symbolic. Fire, transformation, creation, these were sacred acts. Some scholars believe the smelters were associated with ritual, that blacksmiths held a priest-like status. To control metal was to control change. And the rulers of Meroë understood this. They became not just monarchs, but alchemists of power. I walked beside a ruined column once part of a royal workshop. It still bore faint carvings, tools, fire altars, perhaps prayers to gods of metal and flame. These were not idle depictions. They told a truth the world often forgets, that empires are not only built by swords, but by the hands that craft them. Meroë's strength, hidden behind the smoke of its forges, gave Kush its final golden age. For centuries, it stood apart from Rome, Persia, and Egypt. It endured pressures, shifted strategies, and kept its sovereignty longer than many of its rivals. It did so not just through conquest, but through creation. As dusk settled over the slag-strewn plains and the last light caught the curve of a broken forge, I realized something. Meroë's story is not one of lost glory. It is one of innovation, of industry, of unseen engines that moved a kingdom. Iron was their secret, and their strength was forged in fire. The first time I saw it, the script seemed like a riddle carved into stone. Sharp strokes, looping curves, symbols arranged in vertical lines. It was familiar and unfamiliar, like hearing a melody you cannot name. This was the Meroitic script, the written voice of a civilization that spoke in whispers and has yet to be fully heard. I traced the lines with my fingers, feeling the silence between them. The words are there, but their meaning remains locked. The Meroitic script emerged around the 3rd century BCRA. It came in 2 forms: hieroglyphic for temple walls and monumental inscriptions, and cursive for everyday use. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which had survived millennia of translation, the Meroitic language has defied full understanding. We know its letters, we can pronounce many words, but the grammar, the deeper meaning, the heart of it remains elusive. This is more than a linguistic puzzle. It is a wall between us and a people who left behind prayers, decrees, poetry, and prophecy. Without full translation, we are left with fragments, names of kings, mentions of gods, titles of officials, but the full story is veiled. Still, the presence of writing tells us something essential. Meroë was literate. It was organized. It saw power not just in stone and steel, but in the written word. I visited temples at Naka and Musawarat as Sufra, where Meroitic inscriptions climb along sandstone walls. They run beside images of queens and gods, beneath sun discs and sacred animals. The temples here are smaller than those of Napata or Karnak, but they are unique, infused with creativity, surrounded by mystery. Some are filled with elephants, depicted not as beasts of war, but as beings of reverence. Others show kings and queens not bowing to foreign gods, but presiding over their own pantheon. Meroë had its own spiritual ecosystem. The gods of Egypt lingered, yes, Amun, Isis, Horus, but they were joined by local deities with names we barely know. Apademek, the lion-headed god of war and fertility, stood prominently in carvings. Unlike the distant, idealized gods of earlier empires, these deities felt more immediate, more present. They looked out from temple walls with wide eyes and raised weapons. They demanded respect, not just awe. Rituals in Meroë were likely complex, woven from both inherited tradition and local belief. The temples were not only places of worship, they were centers of administration, education, and ceremony. Festivals aligned with celestial events. Priests recorded rituals, presided over offerings, interpreted omens. Yet without full translation of their texts, we are left with gestures instead of voices. I stepped into the shadows of a shrine where a queen once stood. Her image, carved in low relief, bore intricate jewelry and a crown shaped like the sun. She held a scepter in one hand and a jar in the other, pouring something unseen to the earth. The ritual was captured in stone, but the words surrounding her were silent. What did she say? Was it a prayer? A declaration? A farewell? We do not yet know. The Meroitic world remains partly hidden because of this gap in understanding, and yet it feels close, not distant like myth, but immediate like a conversation paused mid-sentence. The presence of writing, even untranslated, is a sign of identity, a mirror turned toward us, clouded but intact. As the day faded and the carved lines fell into shadow, I realized something. To write is to believe the future will listen, and Meroë, in carving its language into stone, believed in its own voice. That voice still echoes, waiting for us to hear it. The Nile has always been a river of passage. Goods flowed north, ideas flowed south, but so did armies. And along its banks, the Kingdom of Kush stood like a tree against the current, bending, never breaking, caught in the tide of empires that rose and fell around it. Assyria, Persia, Rome, great powers, each in their time, each leaving a mark on the edges of Kushite sovereignty, but never fully mastering it. I stood on a ridge overlooking the Nile near the site of Thebes. The ruins stretched out like ribs beneath the sky. Here, during the rule of the Kushite pharaohs, Egypt had briefly found unity again. But beyond its borders, storm clouds were gathering. Far to the northeast, the Assyrians were rising. Brutal, efficient, relentless. Their empire was forged through terror, and their armies rolled over everything in their path. Kush was next. Taharka, the great Black Pharaoh, met them in battle. He had ruled both Egypt and Kush with ambition, faith, and steel. But the Assyrians brought a new kind of warfare: siege engines, iron weaponry, and tactics honed by generations of conquest. There are records of conflict around Memphis and the Nile Delta, victories claimed by both sides. But ultimately, the Assyrians pushed the Kushites back. They sacked Thebes. The dream of a unified Nile under Kushite rule came undone. And yet, Kush did not fall. Taharka retreated to Napata. His successors ruled for generations more. They watched as the Assyrian Empire collapsed under its own weight. The lesson was clear: power gained through force alone does not endure. Kush, grounded in ritual and resilience, continued. Then came the Persians. They swept through the remnants of Assyria and took Egypt as part of their vast Achaemenid empire. Darius the Great, a king who ruled from the Indus River to the Mediterranean, claimed the lands of Kush as well, but his reach was limited. Reliefs at Persepolis show envoys from Kush bringing tribute, giraffes, ivory, incense, a diplomatic gesture, not submission. I visited a temple near Meroë where local inscriptions made no mention of Persian overlords. Life went on. Queens reigned. Gods were honored. Iron was smelted. The Persians may have drawn borders on their maps, but Kush remained sovereign in spirit and in fact. And then, centuries later, Rome arrived. After defeating Cleopatra and annexing Egypt, the Roman Empire found itself peering southward. The desert looked quiet, but the Romans would soon learn it was far from empty. In 24 before the Common Era, a Kushite army led by Queen Amanarinas invaded Roman territory in southern Egypt. They destroyed statues of Augustus, tore his face from temples, sent a message that the South was not to be trifled with. Rome responded, as it always did, with force. But the campaign stalled. The desert did not yield easily. The terrain favored those who knew it. After years of skirmish, a peace treaty was signed. The terms favored Kush. No tribute was required. Borders were established, and Kush, once again, had defended its autonomy against a superpower. As I stood by the riverbank at sunset, I watched the water reflect a sky streaked with red and gold. The same river that carried soldiers also carried silence, and in that silence I could feel the truth. Kush did not conquer the world, but neither was it conquered. It endured by knowing when to fight, when to yield, and when to vanish behind the veil of sand and time. The tides of conflict swept many civilizations away. But Kush stood firm, not because it was the strongest, but because it knew how to last. The first signs of collapse are never loud. They begin as shifts in the wind. A trade caravan arrives later than usual. A harvest is leaner. A river floods at the wrong time. And slowly, what was once a rhythm becomes a struggle. When I walked through the broken streets of ancient Meroë, I did not see a city destroyed by war. I saw a city unraveled by time and by forces no army could command. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the Kingdom of Kush was no longer the power it once had been. Its temples still stood, its pyramids still crowned the hills, but something beneath the surface had begun to break. The decline was not sudden, it was gradual, like erosion, years becoming decades, decades becoming centuries. The signs are there, hidden in the archaeology and whispered through the ruins. Climate was one of the first culprits. The rains that once nourished the savanna began to shift. Patterns changed. Desert crept in where grass once grew. The rich lands around Meroë, once green and fertile, slowly became more arid. Deforestation added to the pressure. Trees, cut for charcoal to feed the iron furnaces, did not grow back fast enough. The landscape began to thin. The soil grew tired. I stood on a hill outside Meroë, looking over what would have once been farmland. Now it is dry earth scattered with thorns. Without stable agriculture, cities shrink, populations move, and the very heart of the kingdom begins to falter. Food insecurity was more than a local issue, it was a threat to the fabric of power. When people cannot eat, they stop building monuments, they stop believing in kings. Trade also shifted. The great routes that once passed through Meroë found other paths. The rise of new powers in the Red Sea and along the Nile Delta redirected commerce. Rome's changing interests, the emergence of Axum in the east, and the instability of Egypt all contributed. Goods that once flowed through Kush now bypassed it. And without trade, the kingdom's wealth began to dry up. I explored what was once a busy market district, its foundations barely visible. Fragments of imported ceramics lay in the dust, Syrian glass, Indian spices, Roman amphorae, but those fragments are old. The newer layers show less variety, more local wares, fewer foreign goods. Meroë was becoming isolated, not through war or invasion, but through neglect. The world moved on, and Kush was left behind. Internal fragmentation deepened the cracks. Regional rulers began to assert independence. Loyalty to the central authority weakened. The royal line became more ceremonial, its power contested or ignored. Evidence suggests that queens continued to hold authority, but the reach of that authority was shrinking. The bonds that had once united the kingdom, from Napata to Meroë, grew thin and frayed. The temples fell quiet. Inscriptions became shorter, simpler. The language itself changed. The Meroitic script, once vibrant and full of mystery, faded from public life. I ran my hand along a column where the carvings had been worn nearly flat. It felt like touching memory, a memory not forgotten, but abandoned, not erased, but left to sleep. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the wind stirred the long grass, I realized that the decline of Kush was not a story of collapse. It was a story of exhaustion, of a civilization stretched thin by nature, by economy, by time itself. There was no final battle, no dramatic fall, just silence, deep and steady, settling across a land that had once burned with fire and ambition. The kingdom did not end, it faded, and in its fading, it left questions behind. Questions not of failure, but of change, of how even the greatest powers must one day bow to forces older than themselves. The pyramids of Meroë are sharp against the sky, their shadows stretching long across the sand. I stood among them in the quiet of early morning. No voices, no incense, no beating drums, only wind and stone. It is hard to imagine that this silent place was once the beating heart of the kingdom, a city of iron, trade, and royalty. Yet every empire has a final page, and for Meroë, that page was written slowly and then all at once. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the Kingdom of Kush had already begun to weaken. The signs were subtle at first. Granaries that once overflowed began to empty. Trade caravans arrived less often. The forest that fed the iron furnaces grew thin. It must have felt gradual to the people who lived here, a thinning of prosperity, a quieting of temples, a sense that the old rhythm of life was slipping away. But the true end came from beyond the desert horizon. Far to the southeast, a rising power was gathering strength. The Kingdom of Axum. It grew from the Ethiopian highlands and stretched its influence across the Red Sea trade routes. Gold, ivory, incense, slaves, and spices flowed through its markets. Axum was not content to remain in the highlands. It looked outward. It looked north. I imagine the first messengers who brought warning to Meroë. Rumors of a king named Izana. Armies on the move. A new faith spreading across the Horn of Africa. A cross replacing old gods. For centuries, Kush had endured foreign pressures. It had resisted Egypt. It had challenged Rome. It had outlived Assyria and Persia. But now, its strength was fading. Izana left behind inscriptions carved in stone. In them, he claimed victory over the Nubians. He called them Kasu, the ancient name for Kush. His words were clear. He said he defeated them with the help of the God of heaven, the voice of a new world rising while the old world dimmed. Archaeologists have found traces of destruction around Meroë from this time. Buildings that ended abruptly, fortifications broken, temples abandoned before their walls could crumble on their own. Yet the most striking detail is what is missing. There is no sign of grand resistance, no great final battle. It is as if the city simply exhaled and went still. I walked through the remains of a royal complex, the stones warm beneath my hand. The floor was covered in fragments of pottery, some painted, some plain, all silent. Once, these rooms held the echo of sandals on polished floors, the scent of oil lamps, the murmur of courtiers. Now, only sand filled the doorways. But Meroë did not vanish in an instant. Cities do not dissolve like smoke. The people scattered. Some fled south, some joined new communities. Others stayed and lived small lives among the ruins. Culture does not disappear, it transforms. The memory of Kush survived in stories, in bloodlines, in quiet pride carried forward through generations. The pyramids remained, guarding the graves of kings and queens. Even when looters tore treasures from their chambers, the architecture endured. The steel, the inscriptions, the artwork, each held a fragment of a civilization that refused to be erased. As the sun began to set and the sky filled with red light, I understood something important. The fall of Meroë was not the fall of a people. It was the closing of a chapter. The kingdom ended, but its spirit did not. The land remembered, the river remembered, and today the world remembers again. Civilizations rise, civilizations fade, but the story of Kush is not a tragedy. It is a lesson. Power does not last forever. Memory does. The fall of Meroë was not an ending. It was a turning of the page. When the last kings of Kush laid down their crowns and the iron furnaces went cold, the land did not fall silent. It paused. It listened. And then it began again. New voices rose along the Nile. New faiths took root. In the centuries that followed, Nubia was reborn, this time in the image of a cross. I followed the river north, past abandoned temples and faded pyramids, into the region once known as Nabatea. It was here, in the 6th century of the Common Era, that Christianity first entered Nubia. Missionaries arrived from Egypt sent by the Byzantine Church. But they did not find an empty land. They found a people who had known gods for millennia, people whose rituals, myths, and symbols were deep as the riverbed itself. Christianity in Nubia did not erase the past, it absorbed it. Temples were repurposed into churches. Old gods gave way to saints, priests became bishops, and the royal courts, once filled with the smoke of Amun and the echoes of lion-headed deities, now sang psalms in Nubian tongues. Faith changed form, but its spirit endured. 3 kingdoms rose from the fragments of Kush, Nubia in the north, Makuria in the center, and Alodia in the south. Each adopted Christianity. Each built cathedrals and monasteries. Each carved a new story into the stones of the old world. I stood in the ruins of Faras, where archaeologists uncovered a cathedral buried under centuries of sand. Its walls were covered in painted frescoes, images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and Nubian kings robed in white. The colors were still vivid, the faces still full of life. This was not a forgotten faith, it was vibrant, local, alive. Makuria became the strongest of the 3. Its capital, Old Dongola, rose along the Nile's curve like a fortress of belief. The city was filled with churches, homes, workshops, and palaces. The Makurian kings ruled with confidence. They negotiated with Arab caliphs to the north. They defended their borders with both diplomacy and force. For hundreds of years, Christian Nubia thrived while kingdoms elsewhere collapsed. What amazed me was the continuity. Though centuries had passed since the fall of Meroë, the people of Nubia still carried the shape of their past. Their art, their language, even their political structures bore echoes of Kush. In Christian manuscripts, some bishops listed their titles in both Greek and Nubian. They honored the new faith, but they remembered the old rhythms. But no kingdom lasts forever. By the 14th century, pressure from Islamic expansion, trade realignments, and internal strife began to fracture these Christian states. Nabatea faded first, then Makuria. Alodia held on in the south, but its power waned. In time, the cathedrals were abandoned. The frescoes cracked, the chants fell silent. And yet, the story did not end there. Descendants of those Christian kingdoms still live in the hills and along the riverbanks. The memory of their churches, their kings, their saints, it survives. Not always in textbooks, not always in maps, but in stories, in names, in ruins that still hold the morning light. As I walked through a crumbled nave open to the sky, I realized something. The Christian kingdoms of Nubia were not just an echo of Rome or Byzantium. They were uniquely Nubian. They carried the legacy of Kush into a new age. They reminded the world that faith can be both ancient and new. And they showed, once again, that Nubia is a land that endures, not because of conquest, but because of continuity, because of belief. The desert hides well. For centuries, the stories of Kush lay buried beneath wind-blown sand, its pyramids and temples standing silent beyond the reach of maps. To the outside world, it was forgotten. A kingdom erased not by time alone, but by the narrow gaze of history. But the land remembered. The stones remembered. And eventually someone listened. The rediscovery of Kush began in fragments. In the early 19th century, European explorers wandered south of Egypt, expecting to find only echoes of pharaonic grandeur. What they found instead unsettled them. Pyramids scattered across the Nubian plain, temples built in Egyptian form, yet different, leaner, steeper, somehow older and newer all at once, reliefs of kings with Nubian features, inscriptions in a script they could not read. Frederick Caillot, one of the first to document the ruins, described the grandeur of Meroë in odd tones. He sketched the pyramids and collected fragments. Later, Karl Richard Lepsius led a Prussian expedition that mapped sites, copied inscriptions, and sent crates of artifacts to Europe. The Western world took notice, but it struggled to understand what it had found. For decades, the Kingdom of Kush remained a footnote in the story of Egypt. It was viewed as derivative, secondary, a mirror rather than a light. But as archaeology advanced, that view began to shift. The more scholars uncovered, the clearer it became. Kush was not Egypt's shadow, it was its equal, a civilization with its own voice, its own vision, and its own endurance. I watched as modern archaeologists worked carefully through the sands. Their brushes moved like whispers across stone. They uncovered streets and workshops, homes and graves. Each artifact added a line to the story. Each temple cleared of rubble brought light back to ancient rooms. The story of Kush began to breathe again. In Meroë, new technology has allowed researchers to scan beneath the surface, revealing roads, buildings, and city layouts once hidden from sight. At El Kuru and Nuri, excavations have brought royal tombs to life. Painted walls, carved offering tables, names long silent spoken aloud once more. And at Musawarat as-Sufra, teams continue to debate the meaning of its elephant carvings and vast courtyards. What matters most, though, is who is telling the story now. For too long, Kush was interpreted through foreign eyes. Today, Sudanese archaeologists are leading the charge. They are reclaiming their heritage not as outsiders looking in, but as descendants reaching back. They know the terrain, they know the language, and they know the value of what lies beneath their feet. I met a young scholar in Khartoum who told me she first learned about Kush from stories told by her grandmother. Stories of queens who led armies, of rivers that spoke in dreams. Now she spends her days in the field, uncovering the very ruins those stories spoke of. For her, archaeology is not just science, it is memory brought to light. The rediscovery of Kush is not about finding treasure. It is about finding truth, about giving a forgotten kingdom its place in the human story, a place not beside Egypt, not beneath it, but beside the world's great civilizations, on its own terms. As I stood beneath the fading sun, pyramids rising behind me, I felt it, the quiet triumph of remembering. The sands of Nubia no longer bury the past, they reveal it, and in doing so, they restore a kingdom once lost to glory once again. The sand is patient. It keeps its silence. It covers what it must. And even when we think we have uncovered everything, it reminds us that history is never finished. The Kingdom of Kush has given us pyramids, temples, pottery, inscriptions, and royal tombs. But for every answer it offers, it leaves behind a dozen more questions. The mystery is not a flaw. It is the soul of the story. I knelt beside a fragment of stone near the edge of a ruined temple. The script etched into its surface was Meroitic, the writing system developed by the Kushites during their final centuries of power. We can pronounce many of the letters. We have identified names, titles, and a few common phrases. But we cannot read it fluently, not yet. The meaning remains just out of reach. This is one of the greatest puzzles in African archaeology. The Meroitic language was written in both hieroglyphic and cursive forms. It adorned temples, funerary texts, and official decrees. It was used for centuries, and yet the key to its full translation remains missing. Without it, we can only guess at the beliefs, laws, and poetry that once shaped the minds of an empire. Beyond the script, there are deeper layers of uncertainty. We do not fully understand how Kushite society was organized. What was daily life like in Meroë? How did families live? How were decisions made? What was taught in schools if they existed? What stories were told to children as they fell asleep beside the flickering firelight? We see the outlines, but the heart of it is still hidden. The royal tombs offer another enigma. Some are richly painted, others are nearly bare. Were there differences in belief or simply resources? The rituals surrounding death in Kush are only partially known. Did they believe in an afterlife like the Egyptians? Did they walk the same road of judgment, or did they chart a different course through the underworld? At Musawarat es Sufra, the sprawling complex of courtyards and elephant carvings, scholars still debate its purpose. Was it a temple? A royal school? A ceremonial site? Its walls are covered with images, but few inscriptions. The silence leaves space for speculation. And speculation, while rich, is not the same as certainty. I met with researchers who spend their lives studying fragments. A pottery shard here, a worn statue there. For them, every object is a clue. Every excavation a conversation with something older than memory. But even they admit that much of Kush remains unmapped, undiscovered, unexplained. Satellite imagery has revealed buried structures not yet excavated. Entire cities may lie beneath untouched soil, but politics, funding, and the difficulty of terrain often slow the work. The past is waiting, but the pace of revelation is slow. Yet the unknown does not discourage, it inspires. The secrets of Kush do not diminish its greatness, they heighten it. They remind us that history is not only what we know, but what we seek. The unanswered questions are invitations, challenges to keep digging, to keep asking, to keep wondering. As I watched the last light fall across the dunes, I thought of the kings and queens whose names we have yet to read, the voices we have yet to hear. Somewhere, just beneath the surface, they are still speaking, still waiting to be understood. The sand may keep its secrets, but we will keep listening. The Nile still moves in silence. Long after kings have fallen and temples have crumbled, the river flows. It does not remember names, it remembers rhythms. And in its quiet current, the story of Kush continues, not as a closed chapter, but as an unfinished song, a melody that drifts across the sand, carried by wind, waiting to be heard again. I walked the banks of the Nile near the old city of Napata. The mountain of Jebel Barkal rose in the distance, its profile unchanged since the days when kings were crowned in its shadow. The temples are worn now, the inscriptions faded, but the presence remains, a kind of gravity in the land itself. Kush may have fallen, but it was never erased. The journey through the Kingdom of Kush is not just about what we find in the ground. It is about what we find in ourselves. In its rise, we see ambition without arrogance. In its fall, we see dignity without defeat. And in its endurance, we find the quiet power of a civilization that did not rely on conquest alone, but on continuity, faith, and identity. The Kushites teach us that greatness does not always shout. Sometimes it builds slowly, in stone, in iron, in ritual. Sometimes it speaks in a language that has yet to be translated. Sometimes it rests beneath sand, confident it will one day be found again. Their story is one of resilience. They adapted when empires rose around them. They thrived in harsh climates, built industries from fire and ore, and crossed cultures without losing themselves. From the first settlements near Kerma to the golden age of Meroë, they shaped a path that was neither fully African nor fully Egyptian, but something entirely their own. I think of the queens who ruled in their own names, the Black Pharaohs who wore the double crown of Egypt with pride, the priests who spoke to gods beneath a sacred mountain. I think of the ironworkers in Meroë, turning raw earth into power, the scribes who carved messages in stone, not knowing how far their words would travel. Kush still speaks. It speaks through the architecture that stands against time, through the language we have yet to decode, through the faces painted on church walls in Faras, through the footsteps of Sudanese archaeologists reclaiming their legacy. It speaks through the questions that draw explorers like us back again and again. The journey is far from over. Every excavation opens a new path. Every inscription still to be read is a door not yet unlocked. And every traveler who stands among the ruins carries something forward: curiosity, reverence, and the understanding that history is not fixed. It grows, it breathes, it waits. As I looked back one last time from the ridge above Meroë, the sun low and golden across the pyramids, I felt no sense of ending, only continuation. The legacy of Kush is not buried. It is rising again, in the hands of scholars, in the hearts of descendants, in the minds of those who wonder. We are all part of this journey now, explorers of time, listeners to stone, seekers of stories that refuse to be forgotten. The kingdom is silent, but the silence is full, and it invites us to walk just a little farther, to look a little deeper, to remember what was and imagine what still might be. Another piece of the puzzle, another name once buried, now spoken again. As the sun sets over the pyramids of Meroë and the shadows stretch across broken temples, the story of Kush lingers in the silence. It is not a tale of forgotten ruins. It is a reminder that even what falls can endure in memory, in meaning, in the quiet persistence of the land. The Kingdom of Kush was never just a mirror of Egypt. It was a reflection of something older, something deeper. A civilization that rose from the margins of maps and carved its identity in iron and stone. It ruled with both strength and faith. It blended worlds without losing itself. It stood not only against enemies, but against time. And though we do not yet know everything, though many names remain unread, many voices still unheard, what we do know humbles us. Kush was complex, dynamic, alive. It gave rise to Black Pharaohs, to sacred cities, to writing and art and ritual still being studied today. It reminds us that Africa's past is vast, sophisticated, and deserving of our attention. To walk through the ruins of Kush is to feel the presence of history as a living force. Each temple is a question, each tomb a memory, each stone a trace of someone who lived, believed, and left something behind. And as we uncover more, through excavation, through scholarship, through story, we do more than preserve the past, we participate in it. This has been one journey, one chapter, but the map stretches far beyond these borders. Other kingdoms wait, other voices call. The dust may settle, but the questions remain. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of Kush, not what it left behind, but what it still inspires. To look closer, to listen deeper, to remember that even the silent places still speak. We are explorers of time, and the journey continues.